One sentence. That's all it took to end a ceasefire. Not a missile, not a meeting. A photo op remark in Ankara, and within hours, Iran answered on 3 fronts at once. What Trump said next, almost nobody caught. Standing next to NATO's Secretary General on July 8th, President Trump said this: "I think it's over. I don't want to deal with them anymore." That's it. One sentence, delivered almost casually, about a ceasefire that had taken months of negotiation, a signed memorandum of understanding, 60 days of painstaking diplomacy between Washington and Tehran to even get to. Within hours, and I mean hours, not days, the U.S. launched a fresh round of strikes, roughly 90 targets across Iran, according to Central Command. And within hours after that, Iran didn't just fire back at American positions inside Iranian territory, it responded across the entire Gulf at once. Tankers hit in the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. military installations struck in Kuwait. U.S. military installations struck in Bahrain. 3 separate fronts activated almost simultaneously in direct response to one sentence spoken by one man standing next to a podium in Turkey. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Was that sentence really the cause of what happened next? Or was that sentence simply the excuse for something that was already locked and loaded? Today, I'm going to walk through 3 competing explanations for why this ceasefire collapsed in the exact way it did, at the exact moment it did. I'm going to use only on-record statements from Trump himself, from Central Command, from NATO's own Secretary General, and from Gulf officials. And then I'm going to show you why the real explanation isn't the president lost his temper. It's something far more calculated and, honestly, a lot more revealing about what's actually happening behind this ceasefire. 3 theories, same 48 hours, only one framework explains all of it. Are you ready? Let's go. Before I get into the evidence, you need the 3 theories by name, because if you don't understand the categories, you can't judge the evidence properly, okay? Theory number 1 is what I'll call the impulsive collapse theory. And this is the simplest possible read, and it's the one most headlines ran with immediately. It says, Trump got frustrated, said something in the moment he probably shouldn't have said with that level of finality, and the machinery of war simply followed his mood. No grand strategy, just a short-tempered reaction to bad news at a bad moment. Theory number 2 is what I'll call the manufactured pretext theory. This says the ceasefire wasn't ended because of one sentence at all. It was ended because Washington already had specific documented reasons to want out of the current negotiating position, and Iran's attack on shipping in the Strait simply gave Trump the opening he needed to say what he'd already decided. And theory number 3, the one I'm going to build for you today, I call the controlled detonation. This says both sides needed a visible, contained flare-up, not a full return to war, to reset the negotiating table, without either side having to be the one that formally walked away from diplomacy. Let's take them one at a time. Theory 1, the impulsive collapse. I want to be fair to this theory because it's not an unreasonable read, and there's real evidence supporting it. Here's the strongest version of the case. Trump's language that day was genuinely personal, not diplomatic language, not the careful phrasing you'd expect from someone managing a fragile ceasefire. He called Iran's leadership sick people. He called them scum. He said, quote, "There's something wrong with these people," describing Tehran's habit of privately agreeing to something and then publicly saying something different. That's emotionally charged language, the kind of thing that sounds like a man reacting in real time, not reading from a script. And the timing lines up with a real immediate provocation. Iran's Revolutionary Guard had struck commercial tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz just the day before, on the Tuesday, while Trump was literally at the NATO summit meeting with world leaders. A U.S. official told CNN directly that the timing particularly irritated Trump, specifically because Iran chose to strike while he was on the global stage, surrounded by foreign leaders. If you're looking for a simple explanation, this is it. Personal insult, personal reaction, personal declaration that the deal is dead. Trump himself even framed it that way. At his press conference, he said, "We can play games, but I'm not sure I want to make a deal. Let's just finish the job." That's not the language of a calculated strategist laying out a multi-step plan. That's the language of someone who feels disrespected and wants it to stop. But here's the problem, and this is the single most important question in this entire video, okay? So pay attention to this one. If this was purely an emotional, in-the-moment reaction, Why did the U.S. Treasury revoke a sanctions waiver allowing sales of Iranian crude oil on the exact same day, hours before the new round of strikes even began? Think about that timing. Revoking a specific economic sanctions waiver is not something that happens spontaneously because a president is annoyed at a podium. That requires paperwork, legal review, an actual Treasury Department decision process. That takes at least some advance coordination. You don't casually improvise the cancellation of an oil sanctions waiver in the same afternoon. You get mad at a press conference. Something was already moving before Trump ever said the word over. Theory 2, the manufactured pretext. This is where it gets more interesting, and I need to walk you through 5 specific pieces of evidence, all from mainstream, on-record reporting, not speculation. Source number 1. CNN reported directly, citing a U.S. official familiar with the discussions, that Trump's decision to move forward with the fresh strikes was due in part to his anger over the Strait of Hormuz still not being fully open, weeks after the Memorandum of Understanding was supposed to guarantee exactly that. Source number 2. That same CNN reporting said the official specifically noted that Trump was losing patience with the pace of negotiations and pointed to what the official described as Iran appearing to slow walk Washington on the nuclear talks specifically. That's not a reaction to a single tanker attack. That's a described pattern of frustration building over weeks. Source number 3. The U.S. Treasury's decision to revoke the sanctions waiver on Iranian crude oil sales landed on the exact same day as the new strikes, according to Al Jazeera's reporting. Removing that waiver is a direct economic escalation, separate from any military action, and it doesn't require an emotional trigger. It requires a policy decision that had to already be prepared. Source 4. CNN's own on-air framing captured the skepticism directly, with anchor Becky Anderson asking, on air, whether there was ever a real agreement between the U.S. and Iran in the first place. That's a mainstream international news anchor openly questioning, in real time, whether the entire Memorandum of Understanding was ever a durable deal to begin with, rather than a pause both sides needed for their own separate reasons. Source 5. And this matters because of what was happening at the exact same time inside Iran. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei had died, and his funeral procession was underway during this exact window, with his son, Mujtaba, having just become the new Supreme Leader. Israeli intelligence, shared with the U.S., indicated Tehran was developing a plan to assassinate Trump, with calls for revenge against him featured at the funeral itself. A government mid-transition, mid-morning, with intelligence pointing toward active threats against the American president, is not a government negotiating from a position of internal stability, and Washington had every reason to know that going in. So when you put these 5 pieces together, the CNN official's account of pre-existing frustration over Hormuz and the nuclear file, the same-day Treasury sanctions move, the on-air skepticism about whether the deal was ever real, and the leadership chaos happening inside Iran at that exact moment, you start to see a very different picture than the president lost his temper. The picture is that Washington had multiple independent pre-existing reasons to want leverage back, and Iran's tanker attack on July 7th simply handed Trump the public justification to act on decisions that were, by CNN's own reporting, already forming before that specific provocation occurred. The data, what actually happened, hour by hour. Now let me give you the actual granular timeline, because theory without data is just storytelling. And I want you to be able to verify every piece of this yourself. The current war originally began on February 28th. By mid-June, after months of fighting, the U.S. and Iran signed a Memorandum of Understanding in Islamabad, covering a ceasefire, the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade, an open Strait of Hormuz, and 60 days to work out the harder issues, the nuclear program, the frozen funds, the long-term administration of the strait itself. Roughly 3 weeks into that 60-day window, on Tuesday, July 7th, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps struck commercial tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Multiple outlets confirmed 3 vessels were hit. The U.S. said it responded with retaliatory strikes on Iranian targets tied to the Strait attack. That's day 1 of the exchange. On Wednesday, July 8th, while Trump was at the NATO summit in Ankara, he told reporters directly he believed the ceasefire was over, adding he didn't want to deal with Tehran anymore and calling further negotiation a waste of time. Hours later, Central Command announced it had launched a new round of strikes, later reported at around 90 targets. aimed specifically at degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping through the strait. On that same day, the U.S. Treasury revoked the sanctions waiver that had been allowing Iranian crude oil sales. Oil prices jumped roughly 6% within hours on fears the strait itself could shut down again. Iran's response came fast. The IRGC said it launched drones and missiles at U.S. military sites in Kuwait and Bahrain, with reporting putting the number of targeted sites as high as 85. NATO's Secretary General, sitting next to Trump at the summit, publicly backed the American response, calling it totally crucial when a ceasefire is being violated, and told Trump directly. It was a very strong response. Stocks tumbled. In early trading that same Wednesday on the news. By Thursday, July 9th, U.S. strikes reportedly hit locations, including the perimeter of a nuclear power plant and a fishing pier in Iran's coastal Bushehr province, roughly 900 miles from the strait itself, a strike Washington had not confirmed by the time it was reported. Trump, still at the NATO summit, doubled down further, threatening to reinstate the full naval blockade and specifically raising the possibility of striking Iran's electricity and desalination plants, which international law experts immediately flagged as a potential war crime, if carried out against civilian infrastructure. He also floated the idea of what he called taking over Karg Island, one of Iran's most important oil export terminals. And in the middle of all of it, Iran's slain supreme leader, Khamenei, was being buried in Najaf, Iraq, in a massive days-long funeral procession with his successor and son, Mojtaba, notably absent from the public ceremonies. Meanwhile, sources told CNN that Israel had shared intelligence with Washington pointing to a new Iranian plot against Trump's life, with calls for revenge invoked at the funeral itself. And even as all of this was happening, regional sources confirmed to CNN that Pakistan and Qatar, the same mediators who brokered the original memorandum, were already quietly working behind the scenes to bring both sides back to the table. Theory 3, the controlled detonation. Now let me put it all together, because this is where the real explanation lives. Here's the core idea. A genuine, unbounded return to full war looks a specific way. No advance warning of scope, no immediate diplomatic backchannel activity, and no clear ceiling on how far either side is willing to go. What actually happened here doesn't look like that. It looks like something both sides needed, but neither side wanted to formally call by its name. A contained, visible escalation that lets each government show strength to its own audience without either one having to be the party that killed the 60-day negotiating window for good. Look at what Trump himself said in that same set of remarks. He said he didn't think the war was restarting, that he thought it would go, in his words, very quickly. That's not the language of someone committing to an open-ended new war. That's the language of someone describing a scoped, time-limited operation with a defined endpoint already in mind. Compare that to Iran's actual response. The IRGC didn't strike Israeli territory, didn't strike deep into unrelated fronts, didn't target civilian population centers. It struck U.S. military installations, specifically in Kuwait and Bahrain, both hosting American bases, both direct, legible responses to the U.S. strikes that had just hit Iranian soil, and the tankers in the strait that started the exchange in the first place. That's a proportional, bounded response aimed specifically at military and economic targets tied directly to the dispute, not a maximalist escalation. And underneath all of the public fury, the diplomatic machinery never actually stopped. Pakistan and Qatar were already working the back channel again within a day of the strikes, according to CNN's own regional sources. The 60-day clock from the original memorandum was never formally declared void by either government, only rhetorically declared over by Trump in a press conference, a very different thing from a formal termination of the agreement itself. Both governments got exactly what they needed from this. Washington got to look tough in front of NATO allies and reestablish economic leverage by pulling the oil sanctions waiver. Iran, mid-transition after Khamenei's death, got to demonstrate to its own population and its own hardliners that the new leadership under Mojtaba could respond decisively to American strikes without collapsing into full retreat. And the actual negotiation, the one Pakistan and Qatar have been quietly rebuilding since day one of this flare-up, never really stopped needing to happen because neither side has an actual alternative to eventually returning to that table. That's the controlled detonation. It's not a ceasefire collapsing by accident. It's a ceasefire being violently, visibly, and briefly interrupted by both sides on purpose, specifically so both governments can go back to negotiating from a stronger domestic position than they had the week before. 3 things to watch for in the next 30 days. All right, we're almost at the end, and I want to give you 3 specific things to track, because this is how you test a theory like this. You make predictions, and you see if the evidence matches. Prediction number 1. Watch whether Pakistan and Qatar succeed in bringing both sides back to a revived version of the same memorandum, rather than an entirely new framework within the next few weeks. If this was a controlled detonation rather than a real collapse, expect the return to the table to happen fast, and expect the terms to look remarkably similar to what was already on paper in June. Prediction number 2. Watch whether the U.S. Treasury quietly restores any version of the oil sanctions waiver once negotiations resume. If the waiver revocation was pure economic leverage rather than a permanent policy shift, its return will be one of the clearest signals that this was a negotiating tactic, not a genuine rupture. Prediction number 3. Watch whether Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba, makes any public statement in the coming weeks, specifically framing this exchange as a demonstration of strength during a leadership transition. If the domestic audience theory holds, expect Iranian state media to lean heavily on this exact episode as proof the new leadership can hold the line under pressure. Here's your homework, and I mean this seriously. I want you to go find the exact CENTCOM statement about the 90 targets struck on July 8th. Then go find the IRGC's own statement about the strikes on Kuwait and Bahrain, and compare the language each side uses to describe scope and intent. Ask yourself honestly whether either statement reads like an unlimited declaration of war, or whether both read like, carefully bounded, specific retaliations aimed at proving a point rather than starting something neither side can control. If you find something that contradicts what I've laid out today, come argue with me in the comments. I mean that. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to look at the same 48 hours and ask a harder question than, did the ceasefire fail? The question worth asking is this: if both governments needed a visible flare-up for their own separate domestic reasons, who actually benefits from you believing the entire deal simply collapsed, instead of understanding it as 2 governments each buying themselves a stronger negotiating position before going right back to the same table? Sit with that question. Look at the timeline we covered today. The tankers on the 7th, the sentence on the 8th, the strikes on Kuwait and Bahrain, the quiet Pakistani and Qatari diplomacy running underneath all of it, and I think you'll start to notice something the headlines were never built to show you. I'll see you in the next one.